Okay, in this one, we're going to be talking about the founder's view on immigration. This is going to be kind of an interesting topic when we go over it, because we're going to be talking about the actual view on what they felt on both the topics of immigration itself, the idea of borders. We're going to be going over the idea of nativism, which is nationalism. You can call it that if you want. And we're going to be going over the idea of naturalization as well, how they felt about this. First of all, the idea of immigration itself with it. We can actually look very, very clearly if we actually go to the National Archives and actually look into the system of the actual full document of the United States Constitution. When we start to look at the full United States Constitution, and this is going to irritate a lot of your Republicans out there, who have actually insisted that they feel that there's some type of restriction on immigration that the founders felt that there should be. You'll actually look through the whole document. You will not see the words immigration, immigrant once. They tend to point to the ideas of words like naturalization. Naturalization has nothing to do with immigration whatsoever. You'll actually find that as well. And when we start to view that, you'll start to look at it and understand that that has nothing to do with immigration, with the actual act of immigration. That's after naturalization. The process of naturalization occurs after they reach the actual United States shores and after they've actually landed here. That process begins once they actually land here and once they're actually on the actual U.S. shores. They're actually fully legal to actually land on the U.S. shores because there is no actual thing. And so that means what we've actually found is that there is no actual thing within the Constitution. Where we've actually have achieved laws with it are actually reinterpretations of the Commerce Clause, which is the most abused law or most abused clause on the actual Constitution. And this is not the way that the actual founders have instructed the Commerce Clause to actually be used. The Commerce Clause was merely to instruct the states not to impose tariffs amongst goods or services, and not to allow these goods and services to pass through states. Meaning, if you were trying to take a shovel that you bought from one state, like let's say if I went down to Illinois and bought a shovel, so that I could take it up to from if I bought it in Illinois, so I could take it up to Wisconsin without them trying to either A, impose a tariff, or B, try to stop me from actually bringing it over. This is to stop them from actually doing so. From them doing so with it for the actual transport of goods. And this is to stop that ability of them being able to stop the transport of goods. Now, obviously, if there's a certain state law that forbids certain goods within that state with it, it's fine with it if that's your final destination. But if you're purchasing a good that's legal in both states with it, and you're that you purchase something that's legal in the state you purchase it in, and then you bring it to the other state that is fully legal to have that in the second state you're actually residing in. There is no reason for them to actually obstruct you from having that good. Now, there's certain things such as where they might put a restriction on such things as fireworks or something like that under those local restrictions of that, which might hamper your ability to have those. So you would not be able to move such goods. And those would be that just merely follows the idea of that 10th Amendment that allows them to do those restrictions. and they're doing it to basically so you're not basically transferring explosive goods. But if you're basically transferring something such as a shovel, they cannot restrict you or make you pay a fine to move said good. They would have to prove some type of damage that could be caused, either some type of ecological damage or some type of health damage, such as an explosion or something. Now, when we look at that, we can actually see that that was not justly caused with that, because they have to put it in the minds of an actual individual, and there's nothing, because seeing that this is not from a state by state, they cannot prove that an immigrant coming through would actually cause harm to that immigrant coming through. Meaning, they'd have to say that the immigrant entering within the country would cause harm to themselves. And they would have to have some valid proof that the actual nation in itself is harmful, which then themselves would have to say that United States itself should not exist. They would need to prove some type of way with that. That's why they cannot show any valid proof on that. There's some type of they'd have to prove some type of harm that they that the individual would go through with it just by that, and in a means of protecting that individual. That it would be basically there's some type of minefield that the person would be going through, or something of that line with it, like a minefield, or in the case of explosions, or in the case of it would have to go into some type of health damage that it would go around, and they'd be willing to violate that Commerce Clause. That they would say that this is worthy of violating the Commerce Clause to create this restriction. And we know that's never been created, that standard's never been created, because the standard has always been basically to restrict these people out of protectionism. As we know that this standard has never been created, and even with this protectionism, we even have evidence on the earliest versions of it. When we start to look at the Chinese Exclusion Act, when we look at it, their idea was actually to say, hey, if we had this Chinese Exclusion Act, we can actually go over and create a standard of lowering unemployment for these railway workers that are citizens, and we can actually help this out. Well, what ended up happening was you actually raise unemployment, and that was the end effect of it. So essentially it had the exact opposite effect, and this was for the citizens out in the West, and so it ended up having the exact opposite effect. And instead of actually repealing any of this stuff, they still kept it on the books. And people with this restrictionist ideas, they've erroneously thought that these things were successful, and they've still kept these ideas that, oh, these things can work. So when we start to view this, we've actually gone over and understood that if when these things fail with it, often these things never come off. And this is what ends up happening with government, is whenever something fails, they never remove it. They just leave it there, and they double down. They say, well, it'll if we keep working with it, it'll eventually work. And this has always been the government policy with the federal government here, is that It doesn't matter which side put it through. It doesn't matter if it's the Republicans or if it's the Democrats. It's always been, we can always rework this. There's always something that can be done to make this thing work. Even if it's a complete and utter failure, they've always tried to rework it. And it doesn't matter how much of a complete and utter failure it is with it, they'll keep trying to. And if you look at the amount of things that were actually removed, you're talking, there's maybe been one or two things historically with it. And one of those was the post office banking system. And that was just because it was a complete and utter failure that it could not work, that it was bankrupt so fast. Because it was basically, it could not sustain itself. And this is one of those things that was actually removed. But when we start to go into the actual thing on the Constitution, we can actually see just in the, when we go back to the Constitution, we can see on the text, there is nothing that actually states that there, in the actual Constitution, as it's meant to be read, as it, which is directly, that there is nothing that actually gives any authority to the federal government. We know due to the Commerce Clause that no state can actually forbid any person from moving from state to state, regardless of immigration status. No person can actually be restricted from moving from state to state. If you hate, such as if you're technically not a citizen with it, I mean, they cannot state you're not allowed to move from state to state. They can't do that. Even if you're not an immigrant, they cannot refuse movement from state to state. That's actually that's technically a even if they even when they technically view you as not as being technically crossing the border legally with it, which is, as we see, it's not actually not actually constitutionally sound. We still see that is actually a federal issue. It's not an actual state issue. Being that is not an actual, and those who've enforced it on the state level have actually gotten into some serious trouble, as we see out in Maricopa County. They've actually gotten into trouble when they've actually tried to enforce it at the state level. We've actually seen that because it's not an actual state issue. That's a federal issue, and if they want to deal with it in a different way federally, and if they want to kind of try to see if they can work another way around it on how to deal with it, they would have called, if the state refuses to comply with that, that would be a violation, because it's not a state issue. And we've seen in this case that it's not an issue in which these states can actually do something about it. Now, when we start to view it on the idea of what is naturalization, naturalization is merely the idea of how to become a citizen. This is nothing more than it, and Congress has the ability to create this level of how many years it takes for this. They can adjust it if they want. Currently, it's set at 3 years. Now, if we look at the amount of 3 years, that was pretty much the consensus of what our founders had of the amount of years for any immigrant that passed over to be able to apply for citizenship and get their citizenship through the actual naturalization process. Obviously, there was one case with it where they felt where one individual felt it should be as high as 12 years, but every other founder felt that that would actually scare away people from coming into the country, and it would actually cause irreparable harm to the United States if they would put it at such a high amount. Now, mind you, this was basically, even at the level of the founders, this was the closest thing that we had in the founders that would be considered as nativist views. Actually, nativist views or nationalism was not even allowed to have an actual viewpoint at the table. They would not even allow any type of views like that. The most extreme views were to basically create the idea in which to become a citizen was 12 years, and that was what it got. And even that was considered to be too extreme. The idea of creating an actual border at any point, mind you, that our first attempt at creating a border was actually pretty late in our actual lives as an actual country. If we look at it, it was actually, we actually created the conflict with Mexico, yet we were the ones who created the border, and we were actually the ones that actually took land from them. It was actually this was not through a voluntary exchange of paying them with it. We had actually took a huge chunk of land from them, and then when they were trying to get it back, that's when there was actually conflict. And it wasn't until a long time after that they actually had established an actual border. No actual border had actually existed until well after this time. And it's actually well into modern era, into actually after I was actually born, that we've actually found that we see that people were actually trying to put a standard of where people were trying to say that a border was necessary. When we look at history, even a border, when there was actually warring that was instigated at all with it, a border would have been more likely to form with on the Canadian border due to wars up there. And it's more likely that a border would have been far more likely there. And that's where we find that's much more of an important issue. And that's something in which we find that it's very, very important, very, very important for people to start discussing. Then that's why when we start to look at the idea of even borders with it, our founders didn't even believe in borders. Why? Because when we start to look at, this is where we start to go into the idea of the free movement of people, ideas, and goods. They are understood that not only within our own country in itself, but also internationally, that this was going to be the only way to success for the United States. If you look at historically, the free movement of people, ideas, and goods has always been the actual way that people have pushed for their own personal wealth, from companies to individuals as well, and obviously, which has become the actual standard for overall in a country how things have actually been done. Now, the more you actually push against this, the more poverty your country is going to have, because companies are going to leave, and you're going to have less opportunity because companies want the ability to move goods, and the more you restrict this, the more companies are going to want to leave, and you're going to isolate yourself. This is just how things go, because you're going against the actual process of the natural ability for companies to move things. Now, what does this have to do with immigration? Well, the free movement of everything is actually tied into this. Whenever you go against history which has been the progress to freely move anything, ideas, goods, people, people as in being able to move on their own, you've obviously restricted the ability for this to happen, and you're going to cut basically wealth and freedom both at the same time. When you do this, you're going to basically kill the actual ability for the nation, what it was actually founded as. This is why when we start to see this, you didn't see any idea that we even that the idea of a border or any type of idea like this was even thought of. I mean, we had a border with Canada with it. We could have erected it, and as we started going out west, we could have started erecting a border with Mexico immediately as the years gone on with it. We never did that. This is only this new idea that ever since protectionism started to come along, that we started this idea of protectionism, actually thinking protectionism worked. And this is really something that has stemmed along with this the nativist views that really started to pop along in the late 1800s. And this is just basically where people like, when you start to go with pariahs like John Wilkes Booth, where his ideas were basically brought in the limelight after the Civil War had ended, and you started getting some of the people from the South that were able to weasel their way into the White House. And this is the whole thing with it, where you started getting these sympathizers. They were starting to bring these nativist ideas into the White House. And then since then, we had actually had more and more and more nativist people come into the White House. And after this point, the more and more nativist people that had come in the White House since that point, you were finding that they were going to essentially put people that were going to be far more extreme in their nativist views, until we actually have the modern day John Wilkes Booth that was the president right before Biden. And essentially he was putting all of his nativist views right out in the open with Donald Trump. And that's basically where we got with that. And that was where you get all these nativist views that are essentially anti-immigration, and all these views like that are anti-immigration, anti-trade, that are completely against the actual ideas of the founders, where they find that the ideas of the founders, where they would actually disagree with the founders, and they trying to proclaim that anybody who agrees with these pariah viewpoints are actually being patriots. No, they're not. Essentially, they would never have been viewed as being within the founders. They would essentially have been viewed as traitors. Automatically, they would have been viewed as traitors right outside the gate. And when we start to view this, we start to view that those were the actual viewpoints of that. Even the most extreme views with it were nowhere near what we find today. The most extreme views back then with it were 12 years for the actual naturalization. Now we're finding that basically that you actually have to go through a process just to cross the damn border. Frankly, with it back then, with their views were basically anybody is allowed in. This was basically the views. This was the universal views of our founders on immigration. And yet we've turned our back on this. This is essentially what we should automatically accept. The reason why our nation was great with it was because we were willing to accept people in. This is how we accepted everybody in, and we let the free market take care of how our system was going to work. We weren't going to protect people because they were incompetent. The incompetent were going to fail. And this was not some Marxist system in which we were going to use protectionism to basically protect the incompetent morons. We were going to basically have, if you wanted to succeed, you needed to improve your skills. And this is how the country actually improves. You do not hold the country back and say, well, because we're upgrading our systems and we're actually becoming more technologically advanced, and we have these people who are in this archaic system with it, we should hold our country back because they just don't want to actually learn a new skill. No, you don't hold your country back. You need to move forward. If they don't want to learn a new skill, sorry, they all got to be fired. And they're not entitled to any benefits. They get nothing. If they're going to be that lazy with it, they get to be homeless. Sorry. This is just the harsh reality of capitalism. If you're not willing to actually work, if you're not willing to actually pick up new skills, you have to deal with the advancement of society. Society goes around you. And this is frankly what it is. People are not going to actually feel sorry for you. Just because your job is not valid anymore does not mean we have to feel bad for you with it. Does not mean we have to punish others who actually had the skills. It means we have to basically move along with it. We cannot hold society back with it and harm everyone else just because you don't want to actually learn a new skill. And government should not be there to bail you out every time that you want that you don't want to actually learn a new skill. You want to live in your own white bread world. And that this is what we've actually found. There's actually been the source of why we've gotten into these problems with it, and why the government has allowed these nativist views in the actual thing and been able to violate the Constitution to begin with, and basically thumb their nose at the actual founders. Our founders want an actual society that moves past. Our founders want a society that actually is progressing far faster. We would actually look far more like the United Arab Emirates or Singapore or Hong Kong or areas like Switzerland if we were actually doing this, and we would not have these broken down towns if it wasn't for these nativist views that have been allowed to fester for over 140 years. And this is the reason why we've had these issues. And if we actually ended all this garbage, and when we start to view these things with it, we need to view the actual source of the problem is because people think that they can get their jobs protected. The jobs are not there to be protected, and frankly, that's unreasonable to actually expect anything more. And the idea when somebody says, oh, but so-and-so said they're going to protect my job and blah, 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 blah. Look at the history with it. Jobs go away with it. If you look at everything from the Middle Ages on with it, you'll actually see as new technology comes along with it, jobs go away, but it creates new jobs. But to get those new jobs, you need new skills. And if you don't get those new skills, sorry, but your job's gone. And this is just what happens. We don't have any room for those archaic jobs. And it's just because we move along with it because we need something far more efficient. And this is just what ends up happening. If you want to know why we see other countries that are doing far better in manufacturing is because they're not being held back by protectionism. They're using the free market to their advantage. They're not basically trying to have their central banks uphold assets and basically trying to allow the government to basically intervene, to basically subsidize all these areas with it, and say, no, we don't want you growing these things because we want to raise the price of goods and things like that, to basically raise asset prices of like farm goods with it. They're not doing any of that. And this is where we find that our government has actually failed us. And it's the same idea with this. You need to understand that in the market, you need to actually improve. And protectionism will not do that. Protectionism is just a failed idea. And this whole idea of nativism is basically just the idea of, if we have competition, if we eliminate competition, then we'll succeed, because then there's less people to compete with us. Then we don't have to worry about that. Well, you still have to worry. It's just it means that everybody's going to be buying things outside. They'll still pay. It means that you'll be able to get cheaper goods made outside, and it means that they're going to be of a higher quality. And that stuff, even with tariffs with it, they're still going to be flooding into the market, and it's going to be a never-ending fight whether they're going to still try to raise tariffs. Jobs are continually going to be lost with it, because no one's going to be able to keep up with it, because they're using archaic technology here at home, and they're always going to be 10 steps behind everyone else, and it's going to be a continually losing fight, because no one wants to actually learn anything new here in the United States, and they're running so far behind the rest of the world. If you want to catch up, you actually have to learn new skills. You can't use protectionism to fight. It's like trying to rig the system with it, when you only can rig it on the home field advantage, when you only have a small area of home field advantage, when you only control a small portion of the games. If everybody has their own equal amount of games with it, you're not going to have a very good record. Specifically when you're forced to play an equal number of games everywhere. And that's the whole point. And when we get back to the immigration argument, is that when we start to look at ideas of naturalization, you'll see that this was something in which I've seen people try to make the argument, saying that we must that people want to extend the amount for people who've already been here. No, they've already, what it called, even at the most extreme cases, these people have already been here beyond that point. They cross here illegally. Well, look at the Constitution. The Constitution shows that there is no authority on this. They should immediately be able to apply. And this is where we need to actually start to re-examine what's actually gone on. What needs to actually be adjusted is we need to start to actually follow the Constitution. And we need to immediately start stripping out these laws that are actually unconstitutional. And this is what needs to occur. It's not that we need to actually adjust the law, anything, or get some comprehensive immigration reform. We merely just need to actually follow the Constitution as written. This means to actually go through and actually eliminate immigration law. Anything that's on the books that basically is not consistent with the Constitution, basically anything that basically says that is restrictionist must be gone. Any executive orders, any actual laws on the books that have actually been passed ever need to be eliminated with it. Anything that basically says that people should be restricted from actually entering the actual country should be eliminated immediately. If we're going to actually follow what the founders state with it, which is actually the intention of our actual country, I mean, if we're actually to believe that that we are still the nation that our founders set, then, and not some horrible Frankenstein monster of what it calls that was created after, and of the what it called of the enemies of the actual country that actually attacked, that actually assassinated Lincoln, and continued to attack and assault our Constitution. Since that point, if that's not the actual who is basically who are in control of our country, then the fact is we should understand that the actual ideas should be what our founders wanted, not what the people who attacked us on January 6th want, not the people who assassinated Lincoln want. It should not be these people who are establishing the actual standard of immigration. The people who established the immigration should be the people who founded the country, not the people who tried to basically overthrow it. It should not be the what I call people of the Confederacy, not the people of the Know Nothing Party, not the terrorists who tried to overthrow it on January 6th of the Make America Great Again movement. Those are not the people who should be allowed to be even considered. These are pariahs of our actual country. These are not people who are actually should be even considered legitimate. And this is the whole thing that we need to actually consider. And when we start to look at it, is we've actually given these people, these other ones, actually control over this system and ignored our founders. Now I'm basically going to cut it here, and that's about it. And bye, everyone.